Welcome to Lesson 1 on gender roles. This lesson will focus on predominantly the role of women in British society after World War II and how the role of women developed from the end of the Second World War, 1945, to approximately 1975. Seated with you today is Mr. Raine, and to his left is
Mr. Suter.
First, let's begin with the Hawkett-Bagley family of Mayfair, London.
So these are decidedly upper class families from a relatively rich background. Now Patricia, the mum, doesn't have an occupation. Women in the era, particularly at higher status, were not considered demure, sophisticated if they had a job. The status of a rich woman was to be a life of leisure, socialise with friends, and eat out and dine out. Although they are somewhat educated in a girls' prep school, that would train you more to be a lady rather than, say, any life skills or any subject knowledge. Her daughter, Florence, follows the same trajectory. She'll be, again, going to a girls' prep school, but she'll be trained there to be a lady, be able to socialise, be able to understand fine wine, be able to be trained how to be polite, however, rather than any subject skills.
A good deal of social concern, just to add to Florence's, will be the ability to marry within your class and finding a perfect match that is suited to your background and suited to your upbringing. Now, you'll notice a major difference between females and males in this regard. Henry, the patriarch of the family, the father, jobs include senior government positions, land ownership, generally that of which his father did and his father before him. He will have received the best education that money could provide, likely have taken the upper echelon of prep schools, Eton, Harrow, following that with Oxford. Perhaps during the Second World War he would have served or had a position in the Grenadier Guards, a regiment known for upper class service. In his leisure time outside of work would have been kept up with a number of social clubs. The Carlton Club, generally reserved for rich elite conservatives. He probably, in the 1930s and 40s, the birth of motorsport and the birth of automobiles in Britain really really attracts a lot of people to organizations such as the British Racing Drivers Club and things like that. And Henry would have been actively involved in a large number of social groups. His other daughter, Camilla, would have... Oh, we screwed this up. It's his wife.
Which one's his wife?
So welcome again to Lesson 1 on gender roles, Mr. Raine and
Mr. Suter.
We're going to take you through the role of women in British society from 1945 to approximately 1975. Noting the evolution of where it came from, a Britain that was, especially in gender roles, Victorian in its outlook, and one that evolves quickly and significantly over a 30-year period. We'll start today by looking at where people were in 1945, and we'll do this on a class basis, as we'll know in many things in this course. Where you start from or what position you're born into in society will in large part determine where you go. So we'll start on our first group with the Hawkett-Bagley family of Mayfair, London. The patriarch of the family, his name is Henry. His jobs outside of senior government positions, which were likely that of his father, he's also inherited land, and land ownership and rents make up a good deal of his income. He will receive the best education, the highest preparatory schools in the land, Eton, Harrow, following that with either an Oxford, Cambridge admission, and during the Second World War, as did many upper class, would have served in the Grenadier Guards. His leisure time, he would have been involved in a number of social clubs and gatherings of the upper elite. The automobile was big in the 1940s and 50s, and a lot of people who joined organizations such as the British Racing Drivers Club, which is less a racing drivers club than a club of automobile enthusiasts. The Carlton Club, a club for rich conservatives. His wife, Camilla, who doesn't have an occupation, her occupation is housewife, but would have received girls' preparatory school training. Her social life would have been taken up with dining, holidays, socializing, and charity work. I'll let Mr. Suter speak more about that.
So, I mean, the big thing with the upper class families is there was a definite sense of divide. Men had their place and women had theirs. And although the women had lots of great opportunities to dine, to go on holidays, and to socialise, they had to do so in a womanly way. And although they're educated, they all went to relatively private, high-end girls' preparatory schools and in some cases secondary schools, that was more to train them to be like a lady, to behave well, be polite, be sophisticated in conversations, perhaps learn a few languages, rather than actually get skilled. It was considered quite beneath women and actually unfitting for a woman to get a job. And instead, her focus was to marry well and do well for herself. And to do that, she needed to come across as intelligent, but not someone who would challenge the man or in career, or be too outspoken. So although there is some advantage to being upper class women, you definitely knew your place. And ladies who didn't, ladies who went on to try to go to one of the few colleges in Oxford which accepted women, were often shunned by their social peers, and particularly men looking for wives, and otherwise controlled into trying to act like ladies in a particular way, which made them at some extent less important in the everyday society.
Okay. The next family we'll look at is a decidedly middle-class family of Twickenham, London. This is the Smiths. The father, who received a university education, has a degree of social advancement that, in previous generations, one would suppose, wasn't possible in this country. Arthur is a civil servant. He works for the government, not in senior positions, but perhaps in finance or labor ministry. He enjoys some leisure activities. He's into golf and other things like that. But because of his education, he has access to more money, better education, better housing, and does live and can provide for his family a relatively comfortable life. His son could reasonably expect to copy his father or outperform him in the future. Now, his son John would have likely received a grammar school education, access to grammar schools and the tiered schooling, as we'll cover in later lessons. Generally gets filled up with the middle class, who have the disposable income to help with tutors that will pass the admissions test, etc. John will have the money to travel with sport. He'll be involved in things like cricket and football. And generally speaking, his outlook is relatively good compared to those compared to the generation before him.
I think moving on to the women, Lucy, the mother, would have had a job, most likely in lower skilled, lower paid secretarial admin work, like being a secretary, a PA, or some sort of administrator. She would definitely not, in 1945, been given any position of real high wages or influence. She was expected, once marrying, to settle down to be a housewife. Some maybe keep jobs on the side, but as soon as you have a child, your duty as a mother, particularly in a middle-class household, was to look after the children. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated when we go to Elizabeth, who is a female student, but also the daughter of the middle-class family. Now, while middle-class families wanted their children to do very well, and part of that entails going to the best schools and going to good universities, obviously the focus was much more on getting the son, John, into the best positions in society, because Elizabeth, when she gets married, will just go to be a housewife anyway. However, despite this, Elizabeth will also spend a lot of her time in company with her mum, teaching her how to cook, mend clothes, clean, and other duties which she would be expected to do once she gets married. So once again, for Elizabeth, her big focus is, while her parents want her to do well, to first and foremost be a good wife, and that requires the skills to be a good wife and for her to know her place.
Now, the two families you saw had what would be reasonably considered relatively decent prospects, at least as far as the males are concerned, for advancement. The reality was very, very different for the lower classes. I mean, this is a class in British society that did not evolve year after year from the Victorian times. Let's take a look at the father Paul. His occupation is a mechanic. He has no major qualifications. He would have had some basic schooling, but likely would not have achieved the O levels, the equivalent of A levels today, nor would he have any reasonable expectation of going to university. He probably would have picked up a trade, been taught by his father, and continued on in the family business, or continued on doing what his father had done before him. Now, because of the lack of disposable income, because his family is living hand to mouth, leisure activities are limited. The social, I guess, the extent of the social life in a lot of ways is the local pub. And that's not to say that Paul is a heavy drinker or anything like that. It's just the place where people met. It's a place where people of like social standings got together. It's where they shared their time. It was outside of the cramped London or other major industrial city living conditions that they would have been subjected to, and it's a way to get out of the house. Now, for Paul's son Joe, he would have received primary school education paid for by the state. He probably would have played on football teams, again, connected with the school. His prospects for advancement would probably have been limited in 1945, but can reasonably, at least he wouldn't know this, but could have hoped to have changed over the next 30 years. But in 1945, the expectation for Joe wouldn't have been far different than to copy his father Paul.
I think going on to the women of the household, the mother Sally would be having two competing jobs. The family could not afford to have one adult not working. They needed the money because obviously work in the factories and working amongst the working class was paid very poorly, and particularly if there was a large family, ensuring everyone was fed and clothed, even to a moderate degree, was quite hard. So she would have on one hand a low paid, relatively prestigious job, one which requires manual labor rather than any intellectual skills, because obviously she hasn't got the education to work beyond manual work. And additionally, when she gets home, she was also expected to act as a housewife, whereas they did not. Whereas Paul worked and Sally worked, Sally was expected to do all the housewife duties, such as looking after children, cleaning and cooking. This is because this was seen as the role of women and the role of the wives. And Frances, the daughter, again, will find herself in a similar trajectory as her mother, relatively poor education, therefore leading her to not get any real opportunities of jobs, getting married often to people in the local area, and then having a relatively low-skilled, low-paid manual job in combination with being expected to be a housewife and look after the domestic issues at home together.
Now, after the Second World War in 1945, women effectively transitioned back into the household and gender roles were reestablished. You may recall after the First World War, women received the vote as thanks, if you will, for their service in the war. And during the Second World War, women's contributions were equal to that of World War I, if not greater. Women were employed in military service, be it working in munitions factories and so on. 2 million women by the end of the war were working in these positions. When the war ended, it was expected that they would return to the home and the men would return to their jobs that the women had previously occupied. Any sort of independence that was gained or wanted by women was limited strictly by the fact that women had difficulty getting what we consider today, anyways, relatively basic help. Mortgages or loans to buy cars or homes, almost impossible to get for a woman. Any time a woman would get a mortgage or a loan, they would need a man, preferably a husband, almost guaranteed to be a husband, to sign off on them. And also, too, anything bought on hire purchase. So a woman needing to buy, let's say, I don't know, something technical, a sofa, or even a typewriter for those engaging in secretarial work, but couldn't afford the cost of a typewriter at the time, and needed to buy it on a hire purchase, would need a man to sign off on it. If life at home, for instance, if the marriage was terrible, be it abuse or neglect or whatever, women had an incredibly difficult time finding or divorcing. Many of them were trapped in loveless marriages and found it almost impossible to get out. In many ways, the home can be described as a sort of a prison for some. The family and the general societal expectation was that it was expected to be a man, a woman, and a child. Anyone living outside of this norm would seem strange, would likely be ostracized from the communities, and so on and so forth.
I think just one thing to add about a couple of things to add. This position that women were the ones who worked at home and the ones who were encouraged to be submissive to husbands was reinforced across society. You were fired by your employers once you got married, or if you got married and then had kids, you were often let go because the men controlled all aspects of society, not just home. On top of that, I think the most important thing is men didn't hate women, and that's why they put them in this situation. Women were seen almost similar to children in the way that men viewed them. Women were nice, they were kind, they would be naive, they were to be looked after, but they were not as intelligent as men. They were not as capable as men. They had a definite position in society, and you had to look after them and make sure you provided for them, and you didn't commit adultery with anyone else. However, you were the man, they were the wife. They had very much specific duties, and they really couldn't be trusted and didn't have the intelligence or sort of background in order to make any real grown-up decisions, as it were.
The limits on women were really enforced in society by education. As you can see here from this slide, for women, most left school at the age of 15. It's not because they couldn't go to school beyond age 15. It was just expected that they wouldn't. Girls did generally as well, or if not better than boys, and that sort of trend continues today, at O levels, and very few continued on. Those who did stay on in education usually took college courses that would feed their traditional gender roles: secretarial, childcare, hairdressing, and so forth. In the 1960s, only a quarter of university students were female. And throughout this period, though that will increase, you will still see the majority of university students being male by 1975. Women, many married once they graduated uni and assumed their traditional roles. So again, even those women who received education did not, in a lot of cases, do a lot with it.
I think schools themselves had divided themselves into, if either formally or informally, male subjects and female subjects. Male subjects were traditionally the harder, more academic ones: science, maths, history, whereas female subjects included home economics, which was essentially learning how to cook, clean, and look after the home, and slightly softer options, which didn't lead to any academic progress or any careers, but prepared them for the home life.
Now, one of the arguments that males use, or men used against women accepting different roles outside of the traditional, was the fact that life, it was considered in 1945 anyway, was extremely busy. Women were needed to take care of the home. Now, the argument that most men had was that, women were needed to do laundry, the women were needed to do the shopping, and this was a day before the mass supermarket chains. There was no Sainsbury's, there was no large Tesco where you could buy everything all at once. Oftentimes, a proper shop would include going to a store for your meat, going to another store for your vegetables, going to a store for your housing or your household items like detergent, and so on and so forth. Therefore, the time that it took to do what we consider really quite basic was substantial. Now, men argued that women were needed to stay at home because no one would be able to do this if both the man and the woman were at work. However, by the 1960s, especially the late 1950s, 1960s, we enter what's known as the age of amenities. Life generally got easier with technology. Most houses had gas, running water, and electricity. I mean, it's a generation or two ahead of you guys, but ultimately, there were a lot of houses in this country where the toilet would be basically an open loo in the backyard that you would have to go outside. Running water, sometimes got from a communal tap, would have to be brought into the house and then heated. Electricity, in some occasions, actually was controlled on a pay-as-you-go box on the wall. So when these things start to change in the 1950s and 60s, building technologies and a lot of these things are provided, it makes life generally easier and less labor intensive. Fridges and cookers become available and, most importantly, affordable, mostly due to mass production. Washing machines and freezers were common, so you could buy food on the weekend and have it last through the entire week. The one-stop shop supermarkets start to pop up, especially in the 1960s. You have old school brands. I think of Sainsbury's being the oldest one. I mean, that was something that was founded out of a traditional butcher shop and then evolves into a large supermarket by the 1960s. Make things generally easier. You can get all of your things in one place at once, and it really cuts down on the time needed to do things. All amenities didn't necessarily help all British women. The lower class family, the Mitchell family, probably couldn't have afforded the higher end of this stuff. Now, I mean, think about a supermarket. Oftentimes you get in a car and you go to a supermarket, you fill your boot with abundance of groceries. Now, for a family that doesn't have a car and can't fill the boot, well, you can't really necessarily fill the boot, so you still got to do some things like that. So the Mitchell family likely wouldn't have been able to afford some sort of car, and probably this was, out of the way for them. Also, too, especially in the higher end, kitchen appliances and so forth, these probably wouldn't have been affordable. Now, basic things would have been affordable. They probably would have had an oven. Fridges were generally provided for, but on the whole, washing machines and things like that were still very difficult to come by. Not to mention the fact that everywhere women turned, their traditional gender roles were reinforced. You pick up a magazine, you watch an advertisement on television, a relatively new thing at the time, and all of the things you see talk about women in the home. Magazines and variety shows and TV always portrayed the woman as the housewife.
I think, yeah, and in addition to that, I think the big issue when we look at the feminism stuff in about 4 or 5 lessons time is, although is this reinforced tradition, and although there is all of this, it is still the case that women had more free time when they could use the dishwashers, when they could use the washing machines, and this led to increasing housewives taking at least part-time work, which then in turn led to more independence of women, which in turn led to a rise to feminism.
Now, those women who did go to work ended up entering a society that, at least in the workplace anyway, was entirely male-dominated. Women's poor educational opportunities really limited how far they could climb in corporations. General social attitudes, especially towards marriage and the family, as Mr. Suter talked about earlier, the fact that women, when they got married, most of the time were asked to leave their jobs if they didn't do so voluntarily, and especially when they had a family, women found it absolutely impossible to advance. Most employment patterns, generally speaking, especially in the large employers like industry and manufacturing, were almost entirely male, even though women did do them through the war. And the attitudes for women who were working, they generally had to face sexism on a regular basis. The picture and quote to the right isn't intended to be humorous. This is actually a quote that was taken from an article. This is something that was said to women on a regular basis. Think of how, I guess, effectively demeaning this would be.
And as this continued, and as women found themselves in a position where they had a very definite set of jobs they could do, but largely they could not, we see that although they've got certain jobs, they are unable to get professional jobs and jobs which give them a status in society and also a degree of respect and a degree of independence. So professions such as medicine and law, which are relatively highly regarded and pay very well and give women the ability, if they have their own money, to move away from abusive husbands, or just to have their own free time, which they can have at their own leisure, and they can choose what they need to do, didn't really exist. Women in particular were not trusted beyond the basic admin level. So yes, you could be trusted to take notes for your boss, but women were generally not seen as intellectually capable of making big management decisions. They were seen to be a bit too emotional, a bit too intellectually not developed, and a bit too poorly educated. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, despite there is an increasing movement of feminism, people saying that this is not right and that women should be equal, we still see relatively traditional values of the average age women get married at 22, with 1/3 of women still teenagers when they get married. This is particularly the case amongst the working classes, whereas middle class and upper classes tended to wait a little bit longer. And as soon as they get married, they find any chance of career from both their employers but also their husband are basically stopped, and they instead are expected to behave like a housewife. And that what the biggest job that requires is giving birth to children. So we find that the vast majority are mothers before they even reach 25, and that basically consigns them to a life of motherhood and housewife duties until they are well past their age that they can make anything of their career, and they usually enter back into secretary work age 50 or 60.
I think one of the important things to keep to mind, and the last point really for this, is I'm going to cycle through a couple slides, which will be available on the PowerPoint that we'll put up on the website. But as we go through this, to take a look at exactly how society subtly is reinforcing women's second-class standing in society. I mean, you just have to look at what the husband's doing. This is an advertisement for coffee, which, selling coffee, one would think, is also advocating for corporal punishment for a woman who, quote unquote, steps out of line. This advertisement right here is something that's talking about sanitary protection and the sort of, I'll let you read that for yourself, but it's hard to believe that, in your grandparents' generation, in a lot of cases, these sorts of opinions, which we consider almost from a bygone era, existed. And here's an excerpt from a women's magazine. Again, when we're done this, please go back through the PowerPoint.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think one of the most interesting things, feminists, these are people who try to get equal rights for women. One of the most interesting things they did at the very start was to get rid of women-only toys, dolls and that kind of thing. They argued that even from birth, children and particularly women are conditioned, that means trained, to act like mothers, behave like mothers, think like mothers, to curtail their expectations, to never expect to be anything other than a mother. And so when they would often have gender neutral toys, that's toys which could work for either boys or girls, or toys which are associated with professions, rather than a dolly or a toy baby, which is they saw as training girls that their job when they get older will be to be a wife and a mother rather than an independent woman.
That's all, folks. That's the end of lesson 1. As I said, when we're done here, please click on the links and read the articles. Go back through the PowerPoint, check out the slides and the advertisements